thanks, Julian. The way we're going to do it is I'm going to speak first for about 20 minutes, then Erica will speak, and then we can move on to Fernando and open up for the general discussion. The title of the session is Subjectivity and Transformation, and I want to approach this question through some work by Fernando that we have known about in the last few days, and some other work and connections that we haven't discussed so far. Fernando, of course, is known for developing a theory of subjectivity, of subjective configurations, which think of the way in which we can develop the work of Vygotsky and the tradition of cultural historical activity theory in order to link with questions of political transformation. And tracing through Vygotsky, of course, raises a question which we did touch on in the last few days, but which I want to make more explicit in this talk, which is the question of Marxism and Marxist theory. Although Fernando is now based in Brasilia, he was born in Cuba, was an active participant in the process of the Cuban Revolution, and was a leading academic in Cuba for many, many years, and for that matter, head of the Psychological Association in Cuba. So, depending on your political viewpoint, a revolutionary struggler for us and with us, or someone that we should be very suspicious of. The other aspect which I want to focus on is psychotherapy. One thing that we didn't talk about very much in the last few days is the fact that Fernando, among other things, as well as being a psychologist, has worked as a psychotherapist and has things to say about the process of psychotherapy and the theory of psychotherapy. When he was in Cuba, for example, he was one of the key figures in brokering international meetings in Cuba, the first international meetings in Cuba of psychoanalysts from different traditions in the Western world. And so, although I'm not going to talk explicitly about psychoanalysis now, I am going to be talking about psychotherapy. So, I'm going to start with a key question for Marxists concerning psychotherapy. And the question, I think, for Marxists when we approach psychotherapy is this: what role does the practice of psychotherapy play in the circulation and expansion of capital? That is, how does psychotherapy enable the production of surplus value so that whether we like it or not, and despite our best intentions, we participate in this phenomenon of psychotherapy that today helps keep capitalism going, even makes it thrive? And the flip side of that question is this: what might there be about psychotherapy that also makes it a force to undermine capitalism and give us more strength to overthrow this brutal, miserable political economic system? Is there something about psychotherapy which anticipates the kinds of relationships that we want to experience after capitalism, and which might even empower us to bring that other world into being? And these are the two sides of the question concerning the reactionary and progressive faces of psychotherapy that I want to address. I should say that this isn't to overplay the role of psychotherapy as an apparatus of social control or as a liberating practice. There are many other things that are maybe more important. But while we're discussing psychotherapy and Marxism, I think we should ask those questions of it. For us Marxists, and I'm a Marxist as well as my comrade Fernando, in a particular tradition of anti-Stalinist politics, seeking to learn from the authoritarian and bureaucratic mistakes of the past and from other movements of the oppressed, there's something else that we need to keep in mind when we ask those questions. We know well that Marx's own analysis of capitalism was partial. He himself was clear that the first volumes of Capital, focusing on production, needed to be elaborated further to encompass consumption and to ground those analyses in the histories of colonial expansion. And Marx even begins to do this in Capital Volume 1, touching on women's labour and child labour, and on the place of Europe in a rapidly globalising world. Now, Marxists linking with new developments in Marxist theory and in what we sometimes call eco-socialism, take that analysis further to emphasize that capitalism is a system of social relations. We see the human beings as more than the reduced individual of classical 19th century political economy, more than the isolated psychological mechanism of this 21st century. We see ourselves as, in Marx's own words, as the ensemble of social relations. That's the phrase that Marx uses in his thesis on Feuerbach. That is a particular kind of ensemble of social relations that cuts us off from our own nature and even from nature as such. And learning from feminism, we appreciate better that the single isolated individual attempting to be master of nature and master of other human beings is also stereotypically masculine. Our alienation from each other and from ourselves gives rise to so much distress that's bound up with either the push to be in control, that is to be a real man, or to be subordinate or passive, to be feminine, as it's understood stereotypically, to be more like how we're told women should be. And these deeper and more open eco-socialist and feminist developments of Marxist politics already connect in some way with psychotherapy. They connect in the sense that we're concerned, as we've always been, with overthrowing the state and seizing the means of production, at last making society democratically accountable, transforming society. That's where the transformation comes in. But we're also concerned with the nature of social relations, in which there's a necessary, ineliminable element of illusion, misunderstanding, fantasy, emotional confusion, even pain, about what it is to work or not to be able to work, what it is to be a man or a woman, what it is to fear nature or want to return to nature. And these issues take us to the question of subjectivity. These issues return us at the same time to some of the fundamental starting points of Marxism, itself in the writing of Hegel, to the anguish we suffer as human beings, to the question of what capitalism does with that suffering and what we can do with it. Now, Hegel's formulation was something that Marx attempted to ground in a critique of political economy. Hegel was someone who was hovering in the background of the discussions in the last few days in the question about the relationship between the subject and object. But Marx attempted to ground Hegel's work in a critique of political economy so we could better grasp it collectively. And this formulation that I'm going to give you from Hegel is still striking today as a diagnosis of what we face in psychotherapy. Hegel says this, and I'll read this quote very slowly so you can get it. Hegel says, speech and work are outer expressions in which the individual no longer keeps and possesses himself within himself, but lets the inner get completely outside of him, leaving it to the mercy of something other than himself. It's a very interesting formulation that has much to say about the nature of language and about the nature of creative activity and of work. This is alienation. Something of ourselves is taken from us and appears to us as an external force out of our control, so that we're at the mercy of something that was within ourselves but has become something other than ourselves. This kind of operation is not merely ideological, that is, it's not merely a mistake, but it's a function of the organization of social life under capitalism. For Hegel, and for some other psychoanalysts, this is an underlying universal philosophical diagnosis of the unending tragedy of the human condition. Marxists, however, focus on the particular ways in which this process is materially grounded and subject to transformation. That is, we make a link between subjectivity and transformation in the material process of changing the world. We assume, and this is the basis of our politics as Marxists, that this subjectivity will change in different ways depending on whether our activity is confined to an individual level or whether it's through collective action. It seems to me that an important part of Fernando's work is to take us to that link with collective processes, with collective action. There's good historical evidence, actually, that collective action does actually empower people, such that they feel healthier and happier as human beings. They realize more of their potential as beings that are indeed an ensemble of social relations. That's when they become human. Outside such times of revolutionary transformation and self-transformation, however, we're back to the question of individual activity, limited steps that we might take to keep ourselves together, to stop ourselves and others from breaking under the strain of living under this inhumane system. And so we come back to psychotherapy again and the role that it plays under capitalism. Now, something has happened as capitalism developed over the centuries, as it's developed and become a global world system. And even more so today, when it seems all-powerful and true, so that it's difficult to imagine that there could be an alternative to it. Here already, we see a first transformation of capitalism. And I want to refer to two transformations of capitalism. This first transformation of capitalism concerns the intensification of what Marxist writers call reification. For Marx himself, reification referred to the process by which we're able to abstract something from our experience, to be able to conceptualize it and examine it in more detail. When we analyze capitalism, or imperialism, or patriarchy, for example, we reify it so we can grasp its nature as a material and symbolic process, independent of us, which then sets the conditions for how we work and think about ourselves. We have to reify it to grasp it and to be able to describe it. So reification gives us a critical distance from reality, so we can begin to think and work together to change that reality. But reification also operates in our everyday uncritical engagement with the world and with other people and with ourselves, when we treat those social relations as if they are things all the time, as if they're things to be manipulated, or they're things that experts with knowledge way beyond our grasp can manipulate. And here, reification becomes mystification. This is the first transformation. And it then, to return to that quote from Hegel, it makes what was an expression of our creativity, something from within ourselves, turn into something other than ourselves, so that we're at its mercy, at the mercy of those things. And we can see this distortion of our relation to ourselves and our own creative capacities through different spheres of activity that Fernando describes in his work. Now, the twist on the process of reification that Marxists noticed then takes another turn, both in some forms of cognitive behavioral therapy and in some forms of humanistic therapy. Now, not only does the inner get completely outside, so that we're at the mercy of something other than ourselves, but then, in these kinds of psychotherapy, we're convinced that these reified things, and this is the twist, we're convinced that these reified things are inside us. This treatment of something inside us, thoughts and feelings that we can't control, is part of a reifying practice in psychotherapy that's part of an emerging process that we've been studying in the Discourse unit called psychologization. Our human capacities that we exercise along with other human beings in social relationships. In social relationships, because we're more than individuals, because we are an ensemble of social relations, they're treated as things, as objects, that some psychotherapists help us to work on, out of our control, but we're told things that can be managed. So we're building up a picture here, through this first transformation, of how psychotherapy works as part of the reifying practice, as part of capitalism. I want to return to the second transformation. One of the amazing things about human labour power is that it produces value. And Marx shows us that this value is divided under conditions of capitalist production into exchange value, that it's the kind of value that we get as products of our labour are traded with each other as commodities, and use value, in which we experience their direct and immediate importance to us. And in this process, exchange value of things is split from use value. So we arrive at a reified understanding of the products that we produce. And here we come to the second transformation of capitalism. Because capitalism has changed over the years. After the Second World War, we saw the rise of the service sector, and most economic production and consumption around the world today is governed now by the needs of the service sector, the provision of marketing, leisure, health, and so on. Psychotherapy being one of those services. And one thing that's happened is that women who had been divided off from the world of work and consigned to the home to tend to the family, to care for children and their menfolk, now become the source of what's become known among feminist researchers as emotional labour. Recent management discourse quite cynically draws on that in order to harness women's intuitive capacities that they've learnt from working in the home and looking after children in order to be good providers of services in the service sector. And in that way, an aspect of ourselves that psychotherapy then works on is part of the commodified process of production in which we work in the service sector. So in a variety of different contradictory ways, therefore, much psychotherapy not only adapts people to capitalism, encourages them to feel comfortable with it, happier with it, happy is the key word here, but it also operates as a moral force. This moralizing aspect is most obvious when we notice that most psychotherapists believe that their clients will be happier when they're like them. It then makes sense to treat psychotherapy not merely as part of the ideological superstructure of contemporary capitalist society, but part of the economic base. Okay, what to do? Okay, I've just got 2 minutes maybe to give the positive side of this. What to do with this? Okay, I'll give you the negative image of psychotherapy, but I want to point to another aspect, more positive. Because Marx himself explicitly referred to the way that specific forms of what he called spiritual production exercised what he called a reciprocal influence on material production. That is, the process that we engage in as we interpret and understand the world is deeply connected with the economic processes. Something of that kind of reciprocal influence, I think, is at work today in the case of psychotherapy. I would say that psychotherapy is a form of spiritual production, and that's how many practitioners and clients treat it. And I say this as someone who was brought up as an atheist and is still an atheist, but I want to take seriously the process of spiritual production. It becomes a worldview when it's treated in that way, often, but it doesn't have to be elaborated in that way. I'm bearing in mind some of the transformations of spiritual production in different parts of the world, where religion has been transformed from being a reactionary force that ratifies forms of social inequality. It's being turned into a liberation theology. And I refer to this quite explicitly now because, of course, Fernando is from Brazil today, which is where liberation theology was elaborated in the 1960s. It makes present in people's lives and experience another possible world beyond capitalism. And this is where psychotherapy could be reconfigured as an experience of self-care and care for others, so that it speaks against an alienating, destructive social system and lays the basis for resistance to it. To do that, however, this more liberating face of psychotherapy would need to link practitioners with clients collectively organising themselves. That's something that's been happening in the work of the Asylum Magazine for Democratic Psychiatry, for example. it would need to take an explicitly political stance against attempts by the capitalist state to use it for purposes of adaptation, and that's where the campaigns against the use of psychotherapy in the Department of Work and Pensions centres has been most important, protests that have involved many psychotherapists, and it would need to break from the enclosure of emotion in which only those who can pay for it can expect to receive a service. And that's where the work of the Free Psychotherapy Network, which has its national conference in Manchester on the 21st of May, is so important. These are political movements that are working on each of these three questions now. They connect with psychotherapy, and I think that Marxists should also actively be involved in them, theoretically and practically. So then we work with subjectivity at an individual and collective level to transform it. Thanks.
Okay.
Straight on. Want to go straight on? Yeah.
Shall we? Okay. Well, I don't have a very well formulated or crafted, coherent paper to give you, but I have some reflections and responses, particularly in relation to the where I'm situated, sort of currently in relation to questions of subjectivity and transformation, and in relation to the kind of ideas and debates we've had over the last couple of days. For those of you who weren't here on Monday and Tuesday, we had discussions and presentations from both Fernando and from Hannah Harvind from the University of Oslo about the developments in cultural historical theory. So, as a sort of starting point arising from, I think, a comment you made yesterday, Fernando, you said subjectivity emerges in the quality of the relations with the other. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that I thought was a very succinct sort of anchor point for me for my presentation today, and also that Hannah Harvind opened up another area of debate that we may return to, saying why should psychoanalysis, and we might extend this to psychology or psychotherapy at least, have the monopoly on subjectivity. And Ian has just raised lots of issues about, as a Marxist analysis of what we might call expertise and authority in relation to the capitalist project of adaptation and regulation. What I want to bring to these discussions about subjectivity and social transformation are sort of some of my current preoccupations around, because I work around children and childhood as well as around an arena for the formation of subjectivity, and we've been dealing with cultural historical theory as well as psychotherapy in my other work, to explore what I'm starting to think of as looking at the child as method, as the focus on the child, the study of the child, the trope of the child, as a lens on models of subjectivity and their cultural political functions and culturally political contingent features. So I think some of you know that my recent work has focused on a psychosocial reading of the work of Frantz Fanon, the revolutionary psychiatrist who moved from Martinique, trained as a psychiatrist in France, and worked as a psychiatrist in Algeria, then becoming increasingly aware of the tensions in a genuine psychotherapy practice in the context of brutal racialized oppression, and became much more of a revolutionary, although he remained a psychiatrist and a psychotherapist in his practice until he died very young, it so happens. Now, Fanon, of course, as a key inspirational figure in revolutionary movements across the world, imports a clearly political agenda that is therefore a very relevant connection, I think, to questions of subjectivity and transformation. His focus is very much around questions of decolonization and the role of models of subjectivity for political as well as personal change and transformation, or rather the absolutely indissoluble connection between those two. And so in formulating or applying this notion that I'm calling Childer's method, I see this as a way of reading cultural political practices, including academic practices, including our formulations around child development, if you like. And so I've been reading this book by a Taiwanese cultural theorist called Chen, who wrote a book published in 2010 in English called Asia as Method. Asia as Method, and in which he highlights the role and responsibility of changing models of subjectivity as well as political transformations. And there are three kinds of moves that he talks about. He talks about, using Fanon in particular, decolonization. He also writes about de-imperialization. And what is particularly relevant in the context of Southeast Asia, but also, of course, in the context of us thinking about what counts as a revolutionary developmental psychology or psychological models in our readings of Vygotsky, de-Cold War. So the de-imperialization is important because he challenges the need not only to de-imperialize the colonized, but actually to change the desire of those who were the imperializers, to challenge the configuration of an imperial desire. So I'm going to say a little bit about, very little bit about each of these, and I'm going to say a little bit about how I think they apply to our readings of cultural historical theory. So my thinking then that informs what I'm saying here in terms of the discussion about subjectivity and transformation. This discussion is therefore to bring a cultural and post-colonial perspective on childhood, including childhood studies, which I think is relevant to this conversation with Fernando and Ian. Now, there are particular convergences from this kind of analysis of Asia as method that I'm now reading as Childer's method in relation to the kind of discussions that we might have and have been having over the last couple of days. They're convergences of method and of topic. And one of the main convergences is around what has been called in cultural studies travelling theory. And indeed, that phrase has been used to refer explicitly to the strange journeys that Vygotskian and socio-cultural theory has taken as it has moved from, both in its varied reception in Soviet Russia, post-Soviet Russia, and of course in the way in which it has entered into American and other English language psychology. And this is something that you've written about very extensively, and others too. So as theory travels and changes, it transforms. It's one of the transformations we're talking about too. How it has been transformed and transforms itself in relation to particular contexts of reception and integration. And these contexts in turn offer a key interpretive lens on those very cultural political contexts themselves. So travelling theory, Said and others write about this a lot. It's a very helpful way for us to think about the trajectories of our theoretical models and what has happened to them and what we do with them. And of course, related to that is that question of translation, by which I mean from one language to another, that we know is a very, very complicated and not straightforward thing. And for many years now, whether it's Michael Cole or Seth Obsheni or Seth Chaiklin on zone of proximal development, and others have been extensively debating and critiquing the ways in which we have have fixed on particular formulations, and you have said this too, Fernando, that tropes or phrases that are associated with sociocultural theory, or particularly Vygotsky, were never actually written by him or said by him. Very interesting. So we have to question what's going on in that process. So, and in particular, as Peter Jones was highlighting in the last couple of days in our discussions, that's also very relevant to this discussion, we have to attend to the residual or even originatory colonial features of the Vygotskyan or sociocultural project in Soviet Russia. There's the, often cited as Luria's so-called disastrous or Uzbeki studies, cast within a very colonial framework of these backward people in this backward state, etc. And we might also connect with how the very notion of the zone of proximal development is itself being, some anthropologists like Joseph Glick are now saying we shouldn't be talking about the ZPD, it should be the ZP we, it's not a singular thing, etc. Now, what's the importance of all of this? I think it's not merely a question of devotional enthusiasm for authentic interpretations of sociocultural theory, or what Yasnitsky and Vanderlei are calling textology, quite an interesting word. But what's important for me in this is that imperial desires, it seems to me, are still very much present in much psychology, and including traces, at least in the history of and current practice, perhaps, of cultural historical theory. So in a relatively recent and very long editorial article, Jan Balsine writes a very interesting review of the project of cultural psychology. But he ends up calling for a project of a general psychology that I think flattens out questions of conflict and difference. And in another quite recent, very long chapter by Ludmila Hyman on the Soviet psychologists and the path to international psychology, she reviews all the varieties and processes and pitfalls of Vygotsky, Luria, Leontev work. Thank you. Plus the particular careers or trajectories of their ideas in the Soviet Union, post-Soviet Union, and in the West, very much along the lines that you've also written about. But she still ends up calling for a global international psychology. Now, of course, it's great to have a kind of global dialogue, and that's why it's so wonderful to have you here and to have had Hannah Harvind here, and many of you are, from many countries, even in this room. So global dialogue is wonderful, but I want to draw attention to two problems that remain. One is how to get beyond the question of the equation between the international, whether it's psychology or education or any other discipline, in an academic theory-building context, meaning English-speaking or often North American. And here we face the linguistic and cultural imperialism of the English language and what it does to our discussions. And applying Chen's ideas, his analysis would suggest that we need to move away from the West as the reference point. So there are in psychology, in critical and theoretical psychology mobilizations, there are South-South networks being formed, which are very important. And Chen also calls for what he calls interreferencing and cultural syncretism. And part of what that cultural syncretism is about is attending to multiple modernities, or the ways in which the notions of tradition or custom are not merely surpassed by modernity, but are being reworked in new ways under changing conditions. So tradition and modernity are not a binary opposition, that need to be revalued, and we kind of move around saying, oh well, but tradition's better than the modern, etc. It's not a tenable opposition. Rather, the question is how they are mutually articulated in particular moments for particular fulfilling particular purposes or agendas or functions with a particular effects. Now, I think the implications of this, we can draw some implications that are useful, that include how we need to attend to our own multiple cultures and reading practices, including those of cultural, historical, or sociocultural theory. So Hannah Harvin comes from a specific Norwegian cultural context, and that has formulated a particular kind of reading and engagement and practice of sociocultural theory, and you have too, and there will be others, and so the question then becomes sort of why we need a general project, or if we need a general project, or perhaps that general project is one of proliferating the forms rather than promoting some kind of claims to unify. So that's one kind of area of question we could talk about. Now, more generally, in psychology, there is another problem, which is that it's still tied to the assumption of psychology as benign and viable. Now, critical psychology of the kind that we've been doing in the Discourse unit for many years now is much less convinced of both those features. And whilst sociocultural theory is not exclusively concerned with theory building in psychology, of course it's very influential in education, in organisational practices, etc. Nevertheless, it's still tied to the same project of linking individual and social development in the name of progress. How long have we got? 5 minutes, thanks. As the object of critique of post-colonial and critical development literatures. So I have two final points that I'll finish in 5 minutes. So I haven't yet mentioned either feminism or psychoanalysis, which I sort of, you might have expected I would. But I do want to say something about their key role and contribution to subjectivity and transformation. Of all the resources I've been mobilising, that is post-colonial and critical development studies, they rely on both of these, both feminism and psychoanalysis, for illuminating the gendered and racialised dynamics and their intersections of those dynamics of othering. Remember, I started off with that with Fernando's quote. Those dynamics of othering that underlie Orientalism, for example. And that includes the gendered exoticisms and the Orientalism of the racialized other that extends also to the temporally distant other, the child. Feminist critics have also disrupted the narrative of the lone great male scientist researcher, and of course we know that just how many collaborative activities Vygotsky and the Soviet psychologists were involved with. It wasn't just the great flashing eyes sort of heroic narrative of the soul scientist that was part of the story in the West about Vygotsky. And feminists have also been central to documenting the complex and shifting agendas around the regulation of control of women and children as juridical and then biopolitical subject matters for and of colonialist and capitalist policies and practices. And all of these are necessary, I think, to any contemporary analysis of globalization and neoliberalism. And in relation to psychoanalysis, I'll just say that it enables, I think, an exploration of the investments that drive these political and personal imperatives. So, just to end, I'll say we need to resist the return of two kinds of dynamics. The first one is of completion, and the second of normalization. Each of these limits completion and normalization. Each of them limit genuinely radical notions of subjectivity and transformation. For to have a closed or finished model of subjectivity confirms what we can be, or confines what we can be to what we are, in all our current conditions of constraint and foreclosed political horizons. While correspondingly, to subscribe to a specific trajectory of development not only reinstalls discourses and practices of normalization, and so inevitably also of pathologization, but it also reduces political agendas of transformation to psychology, that is, a psychologization of politics. So I'll stop there.
Okay.
Straight on.
Yes.
So you can have 22 minutes.
No, I never passed my time.
Okay.
You don't like listen me, but I never passed my time.
You just lost those 2 minutes, I guess.
Okay, I have to recognize that to talk after Jan and Erica is a difficult thing because I was thinking when were talking, and my problem is that my English is not so advantage for integrate spontaneously new things of the scheme I had in my mind for talking with you. Really, I would like to begin to say that subjectivity from our point of view and within cultural, historical, and not only because Jan worked with a different framework, and also Jan and Erica are very engaged in political and social transformation and in political engagement. But political engagement is something very interesting because, for example, I am critical, of course, to capitalism, but I live socialism between APAs. And it is interesting how capitalism, it is not only organized in a social economical structure, but in the subjective structure, in peoples and in leaderships and in political movement. This is something that we practically never have analyzed because something I said, our leadership is more capitalism than many of the owned enterprises and so on. The mythification, the tendency to put over the people, the idea that they have the truth in their hand, it has been something very complicated in the only alternative that the world has been in relation to the capitalism that has been the socialism. And it is interesting because there were persons that put in risk their own life, but when they enjoyed the power, they reproduced it in the level of social subjectivity, many of the mechanisms of the capitalism functioning. Then in Cuba, I was very sensitive to the matter of subjectivity because the collective project nullified the individual creativity, the individual different, the position of individual, and so on. And what I have been jealous in my practice, and also Jan and Erica have talking now, is try to avoid the conservative position in our professional lines of working. And from subjectivity, as I understood it, we are working at this moment in 4 more important lines. First one is to overcome the idea of psychopathology, and definitive overcomes any biological reductionism and any psychiatric nociology in relation to the human beings. And it is interesting because we have some researchers, for example, postpartum depression versus subjective configuration of depression. Because subjective configuration is never standard, is quite singular, and it is impossible to normatize. And what it is important to think about the concept of subjective senses and configuration is there are emotional, symbolical process that emerge during our life, in our culture, in the social practices, and within one history. Then, as I said, I cannot, for example, to explain completely so complex phenomena as mental illness, grave mental illness processes. But when we are working at this moment in our lines of work, in that part that it is important that to recover the citizenship of the person with illness and to follow the subjective development in persons that are completely excluded by their condition, and how it is inseparable of the social integration of the person with illness. As, for example, Daniel is working at this moment. But we are working this together, for example, with the same process that happened in the school. A child with learning difficulties and with diagnosis, because the medical model has expanded to the school. What we are trying to do, first, to facilitate the integration of the child in one social network inside the classroom, and also to change the relation between family and school at the position of the child inside the families. Something that we have observed regularly is that the child with difficulties to learn are completely excluded in the social dynamics in the school. The professor, the teacher never asked something him, even don't look at him, and it is very interesting because our students are inside the classroom, and once one child approached to her, teacher was making an exercise with different childs, and he was participating with different children, and he was participating. He was completely in silence. It seems that he was not paying attention to what was discussing in that group. And after that situation, he came to our researcher, took her hand and said, "Do you want I tell the history that was discussing there?" And researcher said, "Oh yes, very interesting." And the child completely was able to discuss about what was teaching by the professor, who completely ignored him. And one of the facts that influence of that is that our researcher is very openly, very warm, is in contact with all the child in classes, and is the only person in who this child find the chance to enter in contact, to communicate. The fact of have an effective and dialogical communication, that it is not only to assume in the positive term everything that the child wants to do. It is necessary to put limits, to challenge the child, is to confront the child's expression. It is a very alive movement that it is important to take into account. But without emotional relation and a social space in which the child have to integrate, without this, it is impossible to complementary work in the school. Even one of the critics that long ago I made to the concept of some of proximal development of Vygotsky is that the concept was very instrumental, because some of proximal development was sought for the child or the peers support the child to move from the place in which he has or she at this moment in his operation to a new level. This transit, this movement zone, that it is important because overcame the classification of the limitation by intellectual reasons. It was very important point in the definition of zone of proximal development. But if the person who supports the child has not affective relation with him or her, it is impossible for him to advance, because something that we see in the child who is probably in the school is fear, don't trust in him herself. And this kind of question only is possible to advance on when we have a very good network of relationship in which affective relation permits the child to feel secure, safe in his position in the school. This is another important line, and this model we are attempting to overcome the pathologization on the school troubles, disciplinary and every kind of phenomena in the school behavior. And it is also very important because in Brazil at this moment, the number of children, the number of children that are sent to the private consultation is very high. And it is a fantastic perspective mechanism of capitalism, because the medical model work together with the pharmacological industry, and it is a very powerful support, for example, for a convention of psychiatry, of medicine, and so on. But when you try to organize something of communitarian psychology or on education instead of pathologization, you practically don't receive support from anyone. This is another line in which we are consider our practice a practice of transformation, because I remember very well Juan Martín Baró in one meeting at the time in which all us were in the extreme left, and he said, between do something and revolution there are a long distance, but we have walked in this distance in order to short the distance. And it was very significant for me. And it is something that we have very present in our practices. How to enter and to break down the dominant patterns of social practice, and in which extend our theoretical, methodological, and epistemological position help us to overcome the current constraint in professional practice. Another important line that at this moment is not in our group, but that I have participated very active in my history, personal history in Latin America, is the communitarian psychology. It's very interesting, the emerging of new subjects inside communities, and how this provoke very interesting change inside the practice of the community. Because in Latin America, all the poor neighborhoods continue to function as community. In Sao Paulo, you only see communities in the favelas, because you live in a building of 20 floors that practically you don't know anyone in your building. But in the communities, it's very important, the practice, the communitarian activities. And it is very important how persons who are accused, for example, from narco-traffic, they sustain many health and educational programs and give support for health attention in the poor community in Latin America. Then we are working in Guatemala. We began to work in Cuba with poor community, and in Brazil we had some experience also in communities. It is important because it's a way to work collectively that attempting to facilitate the emergence of what we define as subject, social subjects inside communities. The term subjects for me is very important because we live, at least in Latin America, in societies in which most of the people are victims. They need psychotherapy, they need support for that, and all the device for advancing in life are external to them. And then the subject is that person that assumes himself and is able to open new paths of subjectivation and to change his personal system of relationship that also are important for changing the social relationship within the social space in which he is acting. From my experience, looking for collective subjects is a very difficult task, because collective or social subject only emerge in the real contradiction, in the battle of opinion, when you feel comfortable for saying what you think. You know, it's something very difficult, even in the academy, because we have a lot of mechanisms of power and control that are very hidden, but that are very strong. The power, I want to say here, I was taking a note here, that is real. The capitalist is alienated, but we have, at least in America Latina, many religious race expression that are related with capitalism, but that came before capitalism, are traces that were not engendered inside capitalism. And it is something that we have to think very carefully also. For example, in Brazil, the coronelism, that coronels was those people that had a very strong power in one state, practically the owner of the state, and which kind of social consequence it has. And it is more feudal than capitalistic. Then the matter of poverty in Latin America is very, very difficult, very, very delicate question to work with. And the matter of religion is terrible. It's also pre-capitalist and is engendered within capitalism, advanced in capitalism, but associated with elements of social subjectivity that it is different to catch in one formulas of working. For example, it was interesting that in Cuba, my generation is completely was ateo, ¿cómo se dice? Atheist. Yes, we completely, and we thought that the society advanced in relation to religion. And now we have more religion than before revolution. And that expression of subjectivity indicates something that it is not only a relation to the general structure of society, but with configuration of different kind of system of relationship that are very difficult to follow. And I guess that our participation in the transformation is first to have one theoretical model that allow us to make new kind of social practices, professional practice, a different methodology. We are always looking by the emerging of the subject. The other, as the active other that is able to be in dialogue with me and to enter in contradiction with me, and that pass by bad moments, but it is capable to open new alternative. And this is important also in our conception of psychotherapy. I have a book of this, but unfortunately in Spanish and in Portuguese, not in English, and we use a provocation, that the other change from the place in which he is at that moment in his her life, and he have to make confrontation, have to reflect, to be critical, to aggressive me. It's very good when he is angry and go angry. And my English today is because I completely improvise this participation. It's hard, but this is the way in which we work in psychotherapy. The other have to change in the place he is, and he is or she, he will overcome that. It's not my knowledge, but my knowledge help in what sense? I open hypotheses on the basis of subjective configuration. We open elements that we can to follow and on which we proposital work or provocate, but in the dialogue appears things that was impossible for us to predict. But the more important fact is not that the process will right and okay. The more important fact is that the process become live, like living process, and that the other get the capacity to enter in contact, to evoke emotions in relation to me, to discuss with me, to continue thinking about him there. And it's also important to say that for us, psychotherapy, it is not only in the consultation, because some of the more effective psychotherapies I made as professor is inside the classroom after the people left, and I asked one alumni, please, one student, what happened with you today? We open a conversation, and suddenly emerged a very complex network of emotional conflicts. Then, from our position, that is very near of Erika and Ian. Even I say Ian that reading him about Lacan, but he criticized that I have very innovative way to interpret Lacan mode of psychotherapy, and also to conceptualize operation in Lacan that I was not completely conscious, and that light in Lacan in relation to Freud and other theories of the mainstream of psychology. Finally, Julian, for finishing, Erika touched something that for me is very important. The capitalism is the Western culture, the dominant Western countries. And for example, in science, you say you feel this very much. Journalists sometimes ask me some details that I am completely sure don't ask to other people. And who was Leontiev? But please, if this is the Journal of History of Psychology and the reader don't know who Leontiev was, it will read another paper, not my paper, you know, and who was, and what means the political climate after Russian Revolution, the same climate that after any revolution has happened in the history of the humanity. And you came to the point that you feel very uncomfortable, because I am sure that to many other people this does not apply. One problem that we have in Latin America today, in my opinion, science is not for repeating the mainstream theories, it's for be conscious, open paths of working in science, in practice, professional practice, and simultaneous to open a course of theoretical work that are very singular to that theme, and open new paths of confrontation, extension with other groups of the world. But unfortunately, our Latin American psychology is so dependent of the mainstream. And I don't know how Erika and Ian feel when you visit the Latin American, but you are treated as God in the land. God in the land. And you are a very interesting person. I have no doubt. I admire both of you. But no one is God in the land. You have to elaborate your own thinking, to formulate questions, to enrich from the discussion, to discuss from your position, and not to want to be evaluated by their position. It is the real dialogue. I think that we have a very common points, and expressing with different words within different theoretical courses, but this is important in the development of theories, and there are not any theory that is progressist by its own. You know, Vygotsky was very progressive in some points and very conservative in others. And he said work that have been done, because sometimes was mythified. Marxist psychology, everything is good in Marxist psychology. And it happened as Stalinism. Sartre supported Stalinism to the 60s. It was something crazy, because we create myth. And we have to demystify the area of thinking. That is also very important for advancing in social transformation. Okay, this is my point.
I'm going to start sort of collecting, if not names, sort of where you are in the room. If you want to intervene, say something. It might be questions, but it might be contributions to the discussion. And while you're thinking and preparing yourself, I think you should be congratulated on feeling uncomfortable in communication with editors of academic journals. One of my students actually had to change her name in order to get published. They wouldn't allow her to have the name that she has in her own culture. She had to invent a second name. You have to have two names.
MacDougall.
Her name was Zarina, and she had to invent a name by which she's not known in her own country in order to
This is a problem.
in order to go through the process of having the paper published. I don't think there could be anything more identically disidentified.
And even you have two reviewers that give a good opinion of the paper, and the editors enter and push and push and push. It's very,
We love our
very
academic,
uncomfortable.
But it, yeah, it's-
institutions, don't we?
yeah.
So, I don't want to be this person. Well, I'll ask a question, and it may be a very stupid one. Ian talked about the split between use and exchange value in the second transformation. And of course, for Marx, there was no split in the commodity. The whole point is that there's a dialectic between use and exchange value. And use value is not, in the classic Marx anyway, identified completely with kind of, I forget exactly how you put it, but the good things in life, the consumption. For example, labour power is a commodity which the capitalist uses, maybe the exception, as it were. But labour power is consumed in the capitalist production process, and so there are these contradictions, both in the system and within the commodity itself. And you're talking about somehow a split happening in recent capitalism, where this is what I thought maybe you could clarify that for me.
I think the important thing is that there's a dialectical relation between the use value, that is what we can do with the things that we produce, and the exchange value, that is the way that they circulate in the market. There's a dialectical relation between the two, but they're separated as if they're completely different things. As if there's a level of exchange where we buy things on Amazon or whatever, or go into the shops and purchase things, and as if there's something completely different, which is the lovely flavour of the coffee and the marvellous quality of the car that we bought, as if that's a use value. That's the kind of split that operates as an ideological split.
Right, and that's a recent phenomenon in
Well, it's
modern
something.
capitalism.
What I wanted to point to as the second transformation is the way that a particular process happens with the rise of the service sector, in which exploitation happens not only on the basis of manual labour, but also happens on the basis of cognitive functions and emotional functions.
I was wondering whether we were going to sort of beyond Marxism to what's his name? The French.
What's his name?
Not Bourdieu. Close. Anyway, the guy that talks about it's essentially the signifier being more important.
Baudrillard. The transformation has to happen with the intervention of feminist theory, which draws attention to the ways in which certain forms of emotional labour become part of the production process.
So your barista kind of smiling at you and making a heart in the froth of your coffee might be part of the...
And the compulsion in Pret-a-Manger, for example, for the employees to touch and smile at each other and to be friendly to the customer. This is emotional labour, and then becomes the target of kind of psychotherapeutic processes that happen not only in the clinic but also outside as we attend to each other's feelings, and that becomes part of the work that we do.
Okay, well, I thought I would look pretty stupid by asking such a simple question, and there are all these people who are into therapy who know about these things already, perhaps. So you can ask as stupid a question as you like, or make as stupid an intervention as you like. Who's first? Go ahead. So, you want now to go first?
Please.
Sarah first.
Yeah, she'll sound more intelligent than I'll just come on the back of it.
Ian, when you said spiritual production, that is definitely something I would like to hear more about. But I have one question for Erica as well. When you say the child as method, like knowing a little bit of Asia's method, how is it that you're taking that to the child? I mean, how exactly will, is it to think of the trope of the child as method, or does it involve something else?
Well, if you substitute child for Asia, that's rather a large move to make, but you can apply many of the same arguments, I think, in the analytical framework that Chen formulates. So to make that move could suffer from a range of rather major problems. I recognise that. But I think it's worth exploring a bit to see what those readings do in the reformulation of psychological and educational models, for example. I know that there have been kind of discussions about childhood and post-colonisation that, in a sense, reproduce the erasure of the colonised subject in that process, and clearly I wouldn't want to be doing that too. But I think that there are very useful lessons, particularly on the part of Western psychologists who are kind of imported around or educationalists and what we do when we go to Brazil and people kind of treat us like we have all the big answers, and so there are lots of kind of quite practical pedagogical and methodological consequences for those kinds of analytical formulations.
Can I just add? So, for example, the teacher's desire to educate the child in a certain way is equated with the imperialist desire to dominate. Would that be a fair move?
I'm just at the beginning of working with these ideas, but I think certainly that's part of the story.
We used to call it teacher lust.
Oh yeah, and it's the teacher's certainty of the possible certainty of what they have to teach and what that learning would involve. That is part of that story, and part of the you could also use queer theory, or there are complementary and allied approaches that clearly inform this kind of critical project. It's not an exclusive one, but yes, I think the child has been both an imperial subject and a subject of imperialism. Historically and currently in many ways that we have yet to fully explore and understand their consequences for many different kinds of children. Is that kind of give you enough to go on for now?
There's also a question here about the relationship between different kinds of critical theory. I think Fernando is wrong. When we go to Latin America, we're not treated as gods. That's not my experience at all. But most importantly, we couldn't do what we do without the work that's been taking place in Latin America, for example. Actually, our work, our critical work in Britain, has drawn on these approaches and tried to develop forms of critical practice that have been inspired by the possibility of challenging forms of knowledge as colonialist forms of knowledge, and then reflect on how they work here in a colonial centre. And that our relationship with Fernando, I think, is built on that basis, that in a way he teaches us, but he also teaches us from within a structure of institutional academic relationships in which he is a leader.
But maybe with you, no, because you are very democratic and open people.
Okay.
But I want to say something that is a little heretic, but I want to use the forum for discourse. Capitalism have turned and pushing back. Everyone go in the capitalism. But what I like of the concept of social subjectivity is that emerge different kind of contradiction inside communities that even do not know capitalism. For example, when you work in Africa with some ethnical group that are completely out from the general organization, for example, in Angola, or when you work in Guatemala with some community Quechuas that are very from the countryside, and you have a different mechanism of power, system of relation, values that came from the tradition and are very injustice and very unequal, and came from a tradition that came from before capitalism. I afraid that we want to create a Walden 2 of Skinner. There is not perfect society. The socialism was an experiment. I think that, of course, one of the big problems of the capitalism is the inequality and the accumulation of fortune for little group of persons, and the very bad public service, particularly in Latin America, in Africa, worse still. But we have to see what it is possible to do inside our societies to discover many different dynamics that are indirectly affecting but the more general structure of the society, but that are generating inside the institutions. For example, when say that Vygotsky was victim of the censorship in the Stalinism, it was false. Vygotsky was very insignificant for Stalin, and it is very clear in that book that the censorship was inside universities, inside academics, and were very interesting subjective mechanisms that the competitive relation with the other in order to get power and to use the element of the system for some kind of functioning inside institution. It is very interesting to analyze. I asked Ian yesterday that he told me that the university is planning to enter in a strike, but the strike in the university and say here is the same. In Latin American universities have center of thinking, but far of presenting one program to discuss with society and to make critics inside the functioning of the society, they only are interested in the money in power, in pocket. And sometimes we criticize capitalism, but unconsciously we repeat the mechanism of social relation, of power, etc., of capitalism.
Question? I should really take
Go
that
for it.
first.
You sure?
Yeah, because yours can be welcome. I'm not Google it in the
You're going to forget if I don't.
Right.
Just want to come to the idea of the title of this, which is about subjectivity and transformation, and to think about subjectivity as Ian quoted Hegel, who was pretty much pre-capitalist, was he?
On the turning,
On the turn,
modernity was.
right. But is there, and I know we shouldn't talk about human nature, but is there something about subjectivity that actually is transhistorical? So even back to the most primitive of tribes, when they might have an incest taboo, a law, people would be punished if they broke the taboo, totem and taboo, Freud, things like that.
Yeah, I mean, this is Bourdieu, because Bourdieu sees pre-capitalism in northern, exactly African societies, but also within academia. The partial autonomy of the academic culture from capitalism, the political economy of capitalism, the partial autonomy, for Bourdieu they're configured, but there is a partial autonomy. Where does that come from? It comes from the uneven development of history. And so we're partly living in the culture of the medieval university.
That strikes
We reproduce medieval structures of how to write a thesis.
In neoliberal ways.
Yeah, but we are also being invaded, and so there's a sort of unevenness of historical development, as it were. Sorry, but I thought. But I think that his work was very relevant.
Okay, Bourdieu, you might give one answer to that, but I mean, this question is absolutely central, I think, to Fernando's work. It's a question that's provoked by Fernando's work, is when we look at the question of human nature, what is it? What is this subjectivity that undergoes the process of transformation? So, Fernando, you answer the question.
No, in my opinion, because I don't get all your question completely, but I will say something to you. for example, in my experience, it is very interesting because politicians maybe have nothing but have to do with you. Subjectivity is always in movement. There is nothing inherent to the human being across in transcultural way. But what I want to discuss, the point I bring before, and I guess deal with your question, is that, for example, you make an organization that you, from your will and from some of the participants, are very good for all the people there. But the problem is that the ways that this activity configured in the different persons and how it unfolds in the system of relationship is what will define the quality of what you are proposing for advancing in some point. Then it is impossible to think political outside from the way it configured inside the communities, person, groups, to which you address your questions. Because it's the living system of relationship within which are defined the path. It may be very influenced by my experience, because in Cuba, they were making very interesting social programs, but the results were very bad. You know, very interesting. Give homes for population and so on. But the way in which the new social network configured inside the new communities destroyed the real intention, political intention for advancing on this question. It is the way by which at this moment I think that educational process and so on, the only way that you have for advancing is created an atmosphere that facilitates the human, authentic human relation and the past that the young person are advancing on. And we as professionals or as functional politician persons, we have to follow. We have practically as the same of psychotherapy without want to extrapolate one mechanism to another context. But you have to participate to follow, because sometimes the appearance of the degradation is a step forward in the development. Development is not a positive, progressive line, but the question is that we never know as a professional or as a politician is it will go in the right direction. It's impossible to control. And when you overcome the control as a mechanism and the prediction as a device, it is impossible to work from outside trying to create benefits for only in the macroeconomical process, only in the macroeconomical, macro-social decisions. But inside community institution, it has to function in a different way, even inside communities. For example, I don't want to continue to work.
But that's why so many macroeconomic projects fail, because they don't take those engagements.
Go in a vertical way on the communities, on the person. I have not any sense for the communities. You know, it's a problem that it has.
Well, just to follow up very briefly, one thing that concerns me about this is that you've got a community, an organisation, and it's got a boundary around it. And transhistorically, if communities of human beings need an other, a religion, a faith, or prophet, whatever their God might be, then that community is going to have to sacrifice something. And so it almost doesn't matter how you configure what's going on, how nice people are to each other, sacrifices will be made. So racializing the other is transhistorical, and you can engage with people as effectively as you like, but I'm not sure that's going to change.
But is that the point?
I think it's a crucial point, because it puts you in a very nihilistic position in relation to political practice, doesn't it?
But did I understand you right that the answer was no? He said, is the notion of subjectivity transhistoric?
No.
And the answer is no.
The answer is
From my point of view, no.
Okay.
Yeah.
But it's clear.
From my point of view, no.
You can back it up with that historical.
It was very structuralist, Levi-Strauss, and
You mentioned the religious.
the notion of parenthood and so on. Yes, the religion, but the religion in one context. It is, yes, I have not the religion keep of expression of society because it's a transcultural mechanism, subjectivity. I don't believe in that because, for example, my generation was not religious at all.
We might be talking about slightly different things.
I think you are. Well, and what I was trying to say is precisely this tradition modernity kind of thing. I mean, that's one of the arguments from post-colonial theory is a false opposition. You're talking about there are other reasons to account for the rise of religiosity now that don't rely on a trans-historical continuity. Clearly.
Yes.
And there's other ways of thinking about history which isn't linear. The linear way of thinking about history makes you ask the question, was there subjectivity here at the beginning? Well, if you think in a different way about the historical process works retroactively, then of course there's subjectivity all the time in the way that we think about our origins. But that subjectivity in the way that we think about our origins and the way that we think about the past is from now. It creates a certain history for us.
No,
Pick up on one of the points that Erica was saying about do we need a global psychology or a theorising psychology or psychotherapy or whatever it is that we want to call it. And I was wanting to think about world evolution, Marxist world evolution.
Well, I'm glad you named it.
There you
Yes.
go. But it's more to do with, I think we get trapped into these buying positions of elitism, and I do agree that these problems are alive, and I think there is definitely a kind of tradition of certain voices taking the limelight, and I think it was Jeffrey Mason on Masson, I'm going to say, that said about if you have a right for your voice to be prevailing over others, it's a destruction of the identity of the other, which is the worst thing you can do. You're killing subjectivity within a person because you're having your right prevail over them. And we are almost othering different voices. And I think that's why discussions like this are so important, because you've got one opinion from one part of the world and you've got another opinion from another part of the world. And although the context is completely different, there is things that you can share across the board. So you've got, if we go from Fanon, that then influenced Che Guevara and then Paulo Freire, he influenced everyone because of discussions like this and the kind of openness of it. So maybe it's not about kind of global theorising of humanity and people and psychology. We all agree capitalism's probably not the best concept we've come up with, but there needs to be something like a global response. So is it more about having a joint venture agenda against it rather than we all agree on the same point, we're not gonna? Do you think it's something more about we agree to the extent that something needs to be done and addressed in a global sense, because it's a global problem, rather than dividing out?
Yes, and if
I know
you
it's
really
a
want to
realistic-
stir Fernando, you can say this is an object, like
I know it's not idealistic.
the survival of the planet, for example, could be an object of joint activity globally.
Well, indeed.
For example.
But what you're talking about is ethics. Well, maybe I'm thinking something that's what I'm thinking about, but there's an ethical problem here.
I think you're absolutely right. It's a question about how we think the global, whether we think of that in a totalizing way, and usually the way that's been thought of in a totalizing way has been from the standpoint of the West, or whether we think of that global in a different way, which is about diversity, what Erica was talking about different kinds of interrelation between tradition and modernity, or different ways that we can intersect the forms of knowledge that we're producing here and that Fernando has been producing in Latin America.
Because you get into this binary position, you're othering the other research, you're othering their concepts and their realities, and you're destroying their subjectivity, their internal subjectivity, because you're saying, well, we're right. And so there is something more about joint nothingness, which needs to happen through discussion and debate. So is there a possibility of, I don't know, like going too utopian about it? About a world revolution?
Well, I come from a Marxist tradition which is implicated in exactly these kind of problems of trying to prescribe a linear notion of history, and in which Marxism has presented itself as a system of knowledge which becomes a kind of religion in places like the Soviet Union. So I'll shut up now and I'll leave Fernando and Erica to answer this one.
Erica, please.
Well, I can't really respond to that question in those terms, because I don't know what a world revolution. I mean, I support popular mobilisations, but what that project would, it's hard to imagine a joint, what the preconditions could be for the jointed equal agreement of what the object, the goals of a world revolution would be, because they would take different forms in different places, and I suppose the mid-level, Hannah described herself as a mid-level theorist, as a feminist kind of critic, engaged with some of the arguments and debates, particularly the critiques of Marxism that Ian has just acknowledged, and that need to be taken seriously. Then my mid-level interventions are to try and ward off the dynamics of homogenization and linearity that are part of notions of progress development. And this is why also Foucault is important in not foreclosing what will be by the sort of imperatives of what is now, because that will also reproduce some of the same problems.
My idea of configuration is a theoretical and methodological device, and is on the contrary direction of the wholeness. The process configured in different ways, in different places, and in different cultural contexts. As Ian said, the problem of dogmatism in Marxism, it has not been only in Soviet Union. It is very common still today, for example, in Latin America. The cultural historical psychology is coined by different people as social historical, because the name of cultural, it is not very Marxist. The problem deciding the organization of the society. And I think that the young capitalism, as I say before, organized in some ways within which way emerged configuration that provoked collateral effects and a very complex process that in some moment it is not so directly related with the structure of capitalism. For example, the emergence of technology today. It is a core that it is not only defined by capitalism. I guess that technology in itself is a challenge for the social life, for education, for everything. Of course, it is possible to find relation, because the general socio-economical, political organization is present inside the configuration, but by different ways in each configuration. What I want to break down is a direct relation of one structure with processes that has their own life and that are very complex, because it leads off to reductionism. And in this way, configuration, I like so much configuration by this reason. And from epistemological point of view, it's because I never will get in an act of knowledge a full configuration. Frequently my student asked me, have you any way seen a completely configuration? I say, I guess I never will see configuration is a conceptualizing device for integrating things that by other models are difficult for me to integrate, and it is not my aspiration to exalt the knowledge about configuration in my construction. It is something that we have the habit, even through the critique to positivism, to try to engulf all the reality we are studying. It is impossible. It is impossible.
This is the last one.
Okay, I just wanted to reflect on something that Fernando said from a slightly different perspective, and wondered if it related to Ian's discussion, reification. I'm a teacher, and when you described that some students with learning difficulties are sometimes excluded in the classroom to the point that a teacher doesn't even look at them, I had a reaction of horror. As a teacher, I've only taught in this country for the past 15 years, the idea of not even looking at a student or excluding a student because somehow they don't fit in is a horrific idea to me. And I wondered if that's partly to do with the idea that we have about the purpose. What is education for? What should they be learning? Do we have one collective idea of what someone should be learning, and this particular child can't achieve that and therefore they're excluded from that process? And I wondered if that had something to do with reification, the way that in a curriculum or in a school we have a particular set of aims that we want the students to achieve, that in some way is a reified structure of what education should be and what it should be for. And it really made me think about the way that I work in the classroom, and never leave anyone out, always think about their particular aims. But in this country about 10 years ago we had government directives that said every child matters, and actually started to formalise this idea that everyone should be included, to the point that now the idea that you have to focus on every child seems to have disappeared completely. That in fact in a global capitalism, as it manifests itself in the classroom, you get this sense of new managerialism, where the rules and the curriculum and what is written down is what is important, not what they're meant to achieve or how they might focus in on a particular child, or the way that every different child may have some different outcome that they want to come to. So I just wanted to reflect on the fact that that idea that children are being excluded, not even looked at, is horrific, but actually how, if I think about my teaching experience now, it's not such a horrific thing. 15 years ago, I think all the teachers that I work with would find that horrific. Nowadays, most of the teachers I work with probably wouldn't question it, because they're more worried about meeting the criteria or the curriculum, and the way that that's been reified as a sense of what the purpose of education is, rather than being, focusing on every individual child. And it also made me think about the question about global capitalism or the permanent revolution, the way that we could reify these schemas or curriculum for what a Marxist project should be, or ways of overcoming capitalism. So I thought there was a connection between the two.
Yes, it
Can I
has.
build on that? No. Can I? No.
What?
Can I build on that or not? I'm not.
Did you want to respond?
Yeah.
No, but you want
question
to
was directed
to add something to what he said?
Yeah. In a way, yes.
Okay.
It's actually part of the discussion, as you're saying. This kind of just to get back. I think the general concepts we use to understand, or as a conceptual tools, to work with general concepts does not lead necessarily to forceful generalizations. I think this is important when we say, for example, about subjectivity, or for example, we could take other concepts like power, like discourse, and we try to, through categories, and to understand general process through their particularities. And I think this is very important. But one thing I was concerned, and I think it links somehow to your perception of school and educational context, is that there is this risk, and I really agree with both Eric and me in this sense, of the psychologization of society and politics as a natural current form of capitalism, but also the risk of the sociologization of human experiences as also an oppressive and very, very dangerous, let's say, not dangerous, but at least tricky way to understand the process. Whereas I think we could try to construct these ethics and that try to bring different theoretical standpoints together, not as a general theory, as I think it would be impossible taking the different cultural counts, but also with a kind of a similar or close similar ethics, in the sense of building something different from these forceful generalizations or normalization process that we see. And I think that somehow it links to your perception of schools, but just theoretically, maybe.
So, thanks. There are people who are going to have the joy of another lecture in about 10 minutes. So I think this is the time to wind up, unless there's some final adieu from the three of you. I'll invite everybody to say thanks very much for all that stimulation.